Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I am Grbešić from Toronto,
And I'm Luka Mišetić in New York.
and today we will be sharing with you our thoughts as first-generation Croatian lawyers born and living abroad on an important historical period for our Croatian people. 75 years ago yesterday, on May 15th, 1945, near a meadow in Bleiburg, Austria, and continuing for weeks and months across Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, in what has come to be known as the Way of the Cross, tens of thousands of Croatian prisoners of war and civilians were persecuted and murdered without trial, buried in at least 600 mass graves. Yesterday marks the beginning of a criminal campaign of persecution by Yugoslav communist and partisan forces against prisoners of war, civilians, political opponents of the communist regime, and the Catholic Church.
The trauma from these events affected the consciousness of the Croatian nation both inside and outside of Croatia, and still does to this day. The national trauma of these events carries on in the memories of the survivors, their families and descendants, and in the Catholic Church itself. Survivors of these events lived with the scars for decades, some of them now in their 90s, who still retell from personal experience the story of Bleiburg and the Way of the Cross. Other victims in 1945 were the young children who were left to be raised by single mothers recently widowed. Widows who had to raise these young children by themselves in a communist society that was hostile to them. Those young children in 1945 are today grandmothers and grandfathers who have passed on to their own children and grandchildren the experience of their childhood trauma, life without a murdered father in a society that repeatedly told them that their father deserved to be murdered because he was on the wrong side in the war. They grew up knowing that in communist Yugoslavia they could not hope to see the perpetrators of this crime against humanity brought to justice. And so, after 1990, with the arrival of democracy, when the Croatian people removed the Communist Party from power and independent Croatia, there was new hope that the criminals who committed these war crimes would be investigated and prosecuted. Some of the criminals in 1990 would have been in their 60s or 70s or 80s, and therefore still could have been prosecuted. But today, 30 years since Croatia's first democratic elections, the Croatian criminal justice system has not convicted a single person responsible for murder or mistreatment of any of the tens of thousands who were executed and murdered.
So today, it is too late. The perpetrators of this crime against humanity have moved on to face their eternal judgment. The children of 1945 and the descendants of the victims will never see justice served in the criminal justice system. But a just society and a just people, nevertheless, have an obligation to continue to pursue justice, even if in a different form. We are morally obligated to never forget the horrific crimes that were committed, and we are morally obligated to work to identify the perpetrators of this crime. And so we do that again today, on the 75th anniversary of the crime. We are gathered here virtually from our homes all over the world to commemorate the 75th anniversary of a crime against humanity committed by Yugoslav partisan forces commanded by Josip Broz Tito. So let's start by setting the scene.
We remember that on the 15th of May, 1945, advancing columns of Croatian troops had arrived in the meadows south of Bleiburg in Austria. According to British records, at least 25,000 Croats had surrendered to the British Army in Austria by this day. Commander Ivan Mišetić attempted to surrender to British Brigadier Thomas Scott, but Scott only offered them the option to surrender to Yugoslav forces under the command of General Milan Basta. Mišetić surrendered, and Milan Basta assured Brigadier Scott that the civilians would be returned to Croatia and soldiers would be treated as prisoners of war, quote, with the exception of political criminals who would be dealt with by the Allied courts established to deal with this matter. General Scott would later say, quote, I received an assurance from Yugoslav General Basta that they would all be repatriated and looked after. But whether it was observed or not, I just don't know. I have no idea whether they were all murdered. I wouldn't be surprised if they were. But it was known that Croat prisoners of war would face certain death if they were returned to Tito's troops. The Americans immediately protested against any British policy of returning Croats from Austria into the hands of Yugoslav partisan forces. The United States launched a protest of this policy formally on the 17th of May, 1945. They knew that Tito's partisans would execute prisoners of war in violation of international law. The American protest of May 17, 1945, is evidence that the Americans and Allies did not think that Croat troops, quote, deserved to be executed, which some apologists for this crime claim today.
Despite American objections, on May 17, 1945, British Brigadier Toby Lowe of the 5th Corps of the British Army issued the order to hand over all Yugoslav nationals in his area to Tito's forces as soon as possible. He instructed that those being returned should not be told their real destination. On May 19th, Brigadier Lowe signed an agreement with Yugoslav General Joko Ivanović in which he agreed to surrender all Croat prisoners of war to Yugoslav partisan forces. Tasked with receiving the prisoners of war on the Yugoslav side were the 4th Yugoslav Army under the command of Peko Dapčević, the 11th Dalmatian Brigade of the 4th Army under the command of Joko Ivanović, and 3rd Yugoslav Army under the command of Kosta Naj. Major Simo Dubajić was a liaison officer of the 3rd Army, who would play a role in the subsequent massacres. Pursuant to the agreement between Brigadier Lowe and General Ivanović, Croat prisoners of war and refugees were the first ones returned to Yugoslavia, and they were handed over to Yugoslav partisan forces between May 19th and 23rd, 1945. British reports would later record that the Croats had been put on trains on their way to the slaughterhouse.
From records of the 11th Dalmatian Brigade of the Yugoslav forces, it is estimated that the 11th Dalmatian Brigade received from the British approximately 35,000 to 40,000 prisoners in May 1945, which included mostly Croat but some Serb prisoners. These prisoners were taken towards Ljubelj and Kranj in Slovenia, and from there to Ljubljana. From that location, the column was separated into 3 columns, heading towards 3 separate destinations: Zagreb, Novo Mesto and Karlovac, and Kočevski Rog, the biggest mass grave in Slovenia. At Kočevski Rog, the prisoners were taken to the edge of a deep ravine, then either shot or thrown over the edge alive. Several thousand were executed there, including Croatians, Slovenes, and Serbs. Women were also executed here, as were approximately 200 members of the Ustasha youth movement, aged between 14 and 16 years old. The exact number executed is unknown, but Simo Dubajić, who participated in the massacres, claimed that around 30,000 were liquidated. His claims have not been verified because most of the mass graves have still not been excavated.
The British government later in 1945 learned of the massacre of Croat prisoners of war who had been turned over by the British units to Tito's forces. On September 5th, 1945, John Addis of the British Foreign Office wrote that the British soldiers, like Brigadier Scott and Brigadier Lowe, had made a ghastly mistake to turn over the prisoners of war to Tito. Quote, "There is little doubt that there was an extensive and indiscriminate slaughter of the Yugoslav Quisling troops, and it is distressing to think that they were passed across the frontier by British troops." Sir John Colville, Assistant Secretary to the Prime Minister Churchill and Prime Minister Attlee, called the actions of British commanders disgraceful and suggested an investigation to establish responsibility for the death of the unfortunate Croats. He wrote the following in November 1945, and I cite, "Since the incident was a disgraceful one, the War Office should be asked to have inquiries made into the immediate responsibility for handing over to a certain and unpleasant death these unfortunate Croats, while the question of their disposal was still under consideration on a high level. I think we can do more than admit that a serious blunder did take place and that the story does not reflect well on the officers immediately concerned. It is no use trying to hush up an incident that is indefensible." Milovan Đilas, a key figure in the Yugoslav partisan and communist movement, and one of Tito's closest associates, gave an interview in December 1979 to George Urban, a journalist for the English magazine Encounter, where he said, among other things, and I quote, "The great majority of the people the British forced back from Austria were ordinary peasants. They had no murders on their hands. They had not been Ustashis or Slovenian home guards. Their only crime was fear of communism and the reputation of the communists. Their sole motivation for leaving the country was panic." Đilas continued in the same interview by adding, "The British did completely the wrong thing in putting these people back across the border, as did we completely the wrong thing in shooting them all."
The British knew even in 1945 that it was wrong to mass murder these, quote, unfortunate Croats, and that their murder was, quote, indefensible. Colville's letter in 1945 also shows that British superiors did not believe that the Croat prisoners of war and civilians deserved it, like some self-described anti-fascists say today, 75 years later, in their own efforts to, in the words of Sir Colville, hush up an incident that is indefensible. Mass graves from these partisan killing operations are located all over Slovenia. But the executions were not limited to Slovenia. Those not liquidated in Slovenia were forced to march into Croatia, where hundreds of mass graves are also located. Thousands of Croat prisoners who did not make it to Austria were captured in Slovenia and returned to Croatia. The most well-known partisan killing field in Croatia is at Macelj near Krapina. Yugoslav Army Sergeant Mladen Šafranko admitted his role in these events and testified that there should be approximately 130 mass graves in the woods of Macelj, with approximately 13,000 executed soldiers and civilians.
In 1992, 23 pits in Macelj were exhumed, and the remains of 1,163 persons were found, as well as their personal belongings, confirming the victims were both civilians and soldiers. The remains of 2 children, ages 7 and 15, were found in the pit with their hands tied together. Also, among the victims in the pits were 21 priests and monks who spent their last weeks and months in the Franciscan monastery in Krapina and were taken out for execution on June 4th, 1945. Other such mass graves exist in Croatia, including at places like Jazovka. We cannot name them all here today, but we will always remember that these mass graves exist at both known and unknown locations. How many Croat prisoners of war and civilians the partisans executed is still unknown. A conservative number for those Ustashi and Home Guard and accompanying civilians murdered from Bleiburg and on the Way of the Cross is 45 to 55,000, which is the number used by Ivo Goldstein and Vladimir Žerjavić. By way of comparison, in Srebrenica, up to 8,000 people were murdered. We look at these numbers not to suggest that one crime was bigger than another, but to offer you a sense of the scale of the executions carried out by the partisans and communists. and to establish that murders and liquidations of this large a number was not done in heat of passion, but instead was planned, systematic, and organized killing operation carried out by the very top of the Yugoslav military and communist command.
The overwhelming majority of Croatian people were not liquidated at Bleiburg itself, but rather were executed in Slovenia and Croatia when they were returned to Yugoslavia or before they reached Austria. They were forced to walk on death marches that have come to be known as the Way of the Cross. Many victims, some of them women and children, were assembled 2 by 2 and tied together with wire. Some were marched through cities in order to be humiliated and harassed. When gaps in columns inevitably opened up, those at the rear were ordered to run to catch up. To encourage them to move faster, those who lagged behind were often shot without warning. Even stepping out of the column to go to the bathroom could prove fatal. Many prisoners on death marches were taken by train and trucks or on foot into isolated woods, mine pits, or trenches, and shot in the back of the head or slaughtered. The pits were later mined and covered. Many survived the Way of the Cross and have testified about all of these experiences.
The events beginning at Bleiburg on May 15, 1945, are also symbolic because they mark the beginning of communist persecution in Croatia. Particularly seared into the collective memory is the persecution of the Catholic Church by the communists. The communists not only executed POWs and civilians, they executed hundreds of Catholic priests after the war. Other priests were imprisoned or went missing. The motives of the communists for persecuting the church were not simply the product of a desire for revenge due to supposed collaboration. Ivo Goldstein has written that the communist hostility towards the church, and I quote, was really founded on the fact that the Catholic clergy were hostile to the ideology of the new authorities. They supported free Catholic press, schools, associations, and charitable activities, personal freedom, and the return of confiscated property. In squaring accounts with the enemies of the people, several hundred priests and monks were executed. Some churches were destroyed, and monasteries, convents, and seminaries were closed. Archbishop Alojzije Stepinac was himself put on trial. In a show trial, after he refused Tito's request that he separate the Catholic Church in Croatia from Rome. The communists sentenced Stepinac to 16 years in prison and 5 years loss of political and civil rights. During his trial, he told the communists, and I quote, "I claim again in front of everyone, 200 to 270 priests were killed by the People's Liberation Movement. In no civilized country in the world would so many priests be punished in such manner for the crimes you impute on them. In no other civilized country would they be sentenced to death, at most to prison. You made the fatal mistake of killing our priests. The people will never forget that." Stepinac was right. The people have never forgotten the communist persecution of the church, and the people have never forgotten the communist persecution that began at Bleiburg. And we will not forget, because we have a duty not to forget, which is why we commemorate these events every year. We commemorate these events 75 years later, because the communists made a fatal mistake by behaving so brutally, so contrary to the norms established by the civilized world, that even the British described them as indefensible, in the words of Sir Colville.
These facts alone are sufficient to support the conclusion that the Yugoslav partisans committed crimes against humanity. They committed persecution and murder. They violated international law, and therefore the perpetrators of these crimes are war criminals. So who are the partisans suspected of responsibility for these crimes? The perpetrators of crimes of this scale must number in the hundreds, if not thousands. We will never know all of their names, but we have mentioned only a few of their names already. Peko Dabčević of the 4th Yugoslav Army, Joko Ivanović of the 11th Dalmatian Brigade, Kosta Naj of the 3rd Yugoslav Army, General Milan Basta, Major Simo Dubajic, and the senior leadership of the Yugoslav Army and the Communist Party was most certainly involved. Aleksandar Ranković sent a communication on the 15th of May complaining that the partisans had, quote, only shot 200 bandits in Zagreb after the first 10 days of their government. He wrote, quote, you work contrary to our orders, since we told you to work quickly and efficiently and finish all in the first days.
Tito certainly knew and approved of the execution of Croatian prisoners of war and civilians. Tito was in the area of the mass liquidations when the killing operations were at their peak. He was present in Zagreb on May 25, 1945, for his birthday celebrations, and on May 26th, he was in Ljubljana, where he said in a speech, and I quote, as for traitors, that is a thing of the past. The hand of justice, the hand of vengeance, has already reached the vast majority of them, and only a small part managed to escape under the wing of supporters outside our country. Simo Dubajic stated that he personally informed Tito in May 1945 of the captured prisoners. On May 27th, Tito spoke to Ivan Matija Maček, commander of the Slovenian OSNA, in private. The next day, on May 28th, Dubajic received a written order to execute the prisoners in Kočevski Rog. It was signed by OSNA commanders Ivan Matija Maček, with whom Tito spoke the previous day, as well as Max Bache and Jovo Kapicic. Dubajic asserted that he and his comrades subsequently executed 30,000 people at Kočevski Rog, but the number of murdered still must be independently confirmed. Tito's closest associates have acknowledged over the years that Tito knew and approved of the killing operations. For example, Milo Angelas, a key figure in the Yugoslav partisan and communist movement, said that Tito saw mass executions without trial as a pragmatic solution, because otherwise the courts would be too busy. He added, and I cite, there was no way in which the cases of 20,000 to 30,000 people could have been reliably investigated, so the easy way out was to have them all shot and have done with the problem. Slavko Goldstein wrote that Tito led a conspiracy of silence that was intended to conceal the crimes. By any international standard, Tito is responsible for the crimes against humanity perpetrated by partisan and communist forces under his command beginning on May 15, 1945, and thereafter.
The passage of time has ensured that we will never bring the perpetrators of these crimes to justice. But we have a duty to bring some measure of justice to the victims, their families, and their descendants by commemorating these crimes and never forgetting the identities of the perpetrators. The events we have described today are not myths, as some claim. They are facts. The bones in the mass graves testify to the truth of what has been described here today. We are not here to promote any ideology. We are here instead to promote certain values, like the rule of law, and like defending the dignity of all human beings and all human life. We do reject the values of those who think that they can decide which lives have value and which lives can be terminated. Those are the values of some of those who have opposed the commemoration of Bleiburg today. And finally, we support the values of reconciliation, which can only be genuine if the suffering of all victims on all sides is remembered and acknowledged by all. Until then, for as long as there are those who attempt to deny or justify the crimes of the Yugoslav partisans, or who attempt to silence any effort at remembering their crimes, the obligation to commemorate the events that began at Bleiburg continues.